Welcome everybody to the Just Chatting podcast, part of the Nerds Chatting Network. My name is Nate, and on this episode I interview Marshal Julius. Trying to explain what Marshal Julius's job is can only be summed up by the man himself. I have to apologise, we recorded this podcast over Skype and there were a few technical issues along the way, but hopefully the little Easter egg I've dropped at the end will make up for that. To begin with, for people listening who may not know you, tell me sort of your name, where you're from, and what you do for a living, please.
Okay, my name is Marshal Julius. I'm originally from North London. Now I'm in Bromley, which we call South London. Those of us Londoners who can't admit that we actually live in Kent now, but South London. I am a journalist by trade, but it's almost impossible to make a living as a journalist, a freelance journalist these days. I'm a film critic and feature writer. So I do lots of everything. I do lots of social media management. I do a bit of social influencing. I kind of write sometimes for marketing or PR kind of gigs. I also do freelance, film reviewing. I review for BBC Radio Oxford, and I've just written a book. So it's like these days, I don't know the answer to what do you do? It's like, is it an easy question? No. Is it like, I'm a journalist. I have this one simple job, and that gives me everything I need? It's actually more like, you need like 50 different jobs in order to make a crust, basically. Yeah. So that's what I do. I do everything.
You do. It does sound pretty much like that.
It's a kind of geeky world, though. There's nothing grown up or sensible about anything that I do, and so that's from my Twitter feed, where all the nonsense that I do all converges in that one place. People say, "What do you have a website?" It's like, well, yeah, it's my Twitter page.
Yeah, I was looking up your book on Amazon, and your biography on there is just this wonderful couple of sentences. So if you do mind if I quote it.
Go ahead.
Marshal Julius, a veteran nerd with unbound enthusiasm for everything you love. Marshal Julius is a film critic, blogger, broadcaster, quizmaster, and collector of colourful plastic things. Which can I say, behind you, the listeners won't be able to see this, but behind you there is a wall. It's wall-to-wall, floor-to-ceiling, Simpsons and all sorts, and the ceiling's covered in stuff as well.
Literally the ceiling, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Though his lifestyle appears sedentary, actually he's wildly active on Twitter, and there you go, there's your Twitter feed.
Well, that's all you need to know, Don't need to read these, 300-page, bios. That's basically me in a nutshell. I'm a huge nerd. I connect with other huge nerds, and I find that I have a lot of common ground with people. My mum always used to say to me that wherever you go in the world, because we're Jewish, she used to say, wherever you go in the world, if you meet another Jewish person, you have this instant kind of kinship with them. I mean, I don't have nothing particular against religion. I'm not a great fan of organised religion, but honestly, I never felt that way, although I grew up in a very traditional Jewish household. So my mum, if she would walk around and she would see somebody wearing a Magen David, Star of David, she would instantly feel like they had something in common, although my mum wasn't very religious, so I don't know what she was thinking. But me, if I walk around and I see somebody wearing a Batman t-shirt or a Star Wars t-shirt or any number of different, something with Planet of the Apes on, or The Matrix, or, if I see somebody playing with Lego, it's like then I instantly feel like I have an in, I can go and I can talk with them and we have something in common. So nerdery is my religion. That is absolutely my faith.
I'm interested a little bit, if I may, in that the religious side thing there. And you're saying you're not massively religious, but so do you think that's influenced your interests, or has that had any impact on some of the nerdy things that you're interested in? Is there anything ever you thought to yourself, oh, that's at conflict with how I was raised? Or
well, I grew up in a traditional Jewish household, and see, the thing about traditional Jewish households is that there's very little actual faith or belief in God. I don't think many of my family actually have any genuine kind of religious faith, but when you grow up Jewish, there's much more to it than believing in God. God is a very small part of being Jewish. It's much more important that you like deli food, and you're very sarcastic, and you complain, especially in restaurants. So it's like, complaining is everything. I can't imagine why God didn't disown us when we were walking around, 40 years in the desert with Moses. I cannot imagine the level of complaining. After an hour, it would have probably been, are we there yet? It's like, we're hungry. It's like 40 of that. I think that is built into all Jews' DNA. As soon as we're born, it's like already we've been walking around for 40 years fruitlessly, and we're just born with this incredible urge to bitch and moan and complain about everything. And I say that with absolute love. I absolutely embrace my Jewish roots.
Yeah.
But for me, being Jewish means insult comedy, sarcasm, enormous sandwiches, and weight disorders, certainly in my experience.
Okay.
Nothing to do with God. So yes, I enjoy sarcastic material, but I honestly don't have any religious faith at all. I went to a Jewish school,
right.
And if there was any doubt that I didn't believe in God before I went there, by the time I left, I was quite militantly irreligious.
That's very interesting. I do genuinely find that interesting. One of my other side podcasts that I work on is it's called Date Night with Delilah, and it's the host for that is a doctor called Dr. Rebecca Welton, and the whole content is talking about religion, quite specifically the Old Testament, so the Hebrew Bible, in media and how it's depicted in media. So for me, you saying, I come from a Jewish background, I'm like, ping ping, things are starting to trigger.
I like almost everything else. Almost everything I know from films and TV shows and comic books. So I suppose, like religious people, I have no idea what's real and what isn't.
Fair enough. Okay, so you've got this book coming out, which as soon as I saw the title of it, and we were kind of connected. I mean, we've connected on Twitter a couple of times over different things, but there was a Vintage GT, who's Jim Bob Squarepants, who's a long time Twitter friend of mine, who messaged you and said, "Oh, you should talk to Marshall." And there's this book, and I saw your book, and I was like, right, add to list, having that on Amazon. So, do you want to tell me a little bit about what it is, and then I want to talk a little bit about how you wrote it and all those sorts of things. So, a little summary maybe.
Okay, so when I started being a nerd, it was in the days before it was kind of acceptable and actually kind of cool to be a nerd. It was in the days of if you were seen reading a comic on train or something, people would point and bully. People would generally not quite get you at school. You were a bit of an outcast. Anyway, I suppose everybody knew that I was the big nerd at school, certainly, and my only friends were huge nerds as well. And everything we did was somehow nerdily related. Yeah, I guess I felt for a long time kind of a lot of ownership over being a nerd. And I took great pride in being the person who my friends would call if they were at a pub quiz or there was a film title or something that they couldn't quite remember, and they were having a discussion. I would get random calls throughout the day in the 80s. In the 90s and the pre-internet times when people could just look it up for themselves.
Yeah.
And they would say, Marshall, who starred in this, who directed that, can you name 3 of this, or and I would just kind of trip it off the top of my head. And my cousin Ronald, he was the same. He was a few years older than me. He's a few years older than me, and he kind of, between him and my mum and a few other nerdy influences, I just grew up fascinated by everything. We used to pull the sofa close to the TV, and Saturday afternoons there would always be kind of like, this is in the kind of 70s, there would always be like double bills on TV in the afternoon. So, on like BBC One and ITV, there'd be all that sport bullshit, just busy work, people running around kicking stuff or throwing stuff, just completely pointless, because next week will be the same and again and again and again. So instead, my mum and I, she would show me the films that were important to her when she was growing up, and she was a nerd, in the 40s before the term even existed. So I grew up watching Humphrey Bogart movies, Bob Hope movies, loads. She loved musicals, but really she liked anything good. So I just grew up watching, all these wonderful old kind of black and white and kind of 50s movies, and she would tell me who everybody was. She would tell me a little bit about the directors, but the actors and that kind of vintage Hollywood trivia was kind of her thing. So, years before commentaries were even a thing, I used to sit there and she would just tell me all about the films, and it just completely filled me up with this kind of passion for just enthusiasm. It's like, I'm very passionate about being enthusiastic about things, about knowing everything about something, I just find the story behind the story absolutely fascinating. And she just loved it all so much. The way she talked about the actors, she just had this genuine affection, not this kind of blind star love, but she was just very into it. And my cousin Ronald, he was a big collector.
Right.
So I used to go to his house, and he would have boxes of trading cards and stuff that he somehow got from the States before you could just go on eBay and get it.
Yeah.
You know, I had no idea how he got it. I used to make him go through his collection every single time. He had a helmet from Star Wars. I mean, I really still don't know. I'm still hate him. But he says he's going to be buried in it. So yeah, I'll probably never. That's that. So there's my murder plans. But I just had these very strong influences, and I just grew up loving a lot of things. You know, Doctor Who. It's really mainly Tom Baker, but also, you know, kind of Star Trek, and we would seek these things out. They weren't just laid out on a platter for us. You know, you couldn't just put on YouTube and do a search for, you know, Twilight Zone and find a dozen episodes, or, you know, you couldn't just like illegally download stuff, or you couldn't go onto Amazon or streaming and just have instant access to millions of hours of everything. I mean, now it's just sport for choice. It's like, what you're going to watch. It's like, what can't you watch?
Yeah.
It's all available. But back in the day, you know, we had to search through the radio and TV times, looking like all the late times, because most of the stuff that we wanted to watch was on at 3:00 in the morning. It was just filler stuff, geeky stuff.
I remember Channel 4 did a Godzilla marathon, and it was like 12 hours from 8 in the evening to 8 in the morning, and I remember staying up watching the old Toho movies for that. You know, exactly what you're describing there, like Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla. Never occurred to me that Mechagodzilla existed, but suddenly it was listed there in TV Times. You know.
I know, exactly. It just, but it was like kind of finding treasure, right? It was like, and when we started, and when, you know, VHS became a thing, and we started taping, and then we realised that we could hook up 2 VHSs, and we could copy from one to another, and we could make compilations of, you know, TV theme tunes, and I mean, you know, we just, like, every chance we ever had, we kind of geeked out about everything, and we'd swap like news items that we'd recorded about, you know, the Star Wars coming out, or, you know, Return of the Jedi coming out. And God, you know, side note, the bloody BBC, when Return of the Jedi came out, they interviewed this little kid who we all hate, me and my friends all hate. I suppose when Darth Vader died, and this was like the first night that the film came out, they actually had it on the news. Those bastards, unbelievable bastards. You know, people talk about spoilers. It's like, fuck that. We waited 3 years to watch the last Star Wars film, and like the day before we saw it, this kid, the BBC just, you know, it's like, you know, not like turn away if you don't want to learn something. It's like, so like, I grew up immersed in all this stuff, just being filled with, you know, kind of all this knowledge, not useless knowledge. I mean, you know, if I was on a desert island, none of it would be useful. You know, it wouldn't be. I would starve to death. I wouldn't know how to gather water and moisture from the atmosphere. I wouldn't know. I mean, although I watched a lot of Tarzan films, how to build a rudimentary hut to protect me from the elements. You know, I don't think I could climb a coconut. I don't actually like coconuts anyway, so I wouldn't live. So I don't have useful knowledge, but I could retain all this other stuff. And then I suppose when the internet came in and people asked me less and less for that stuff, it would more come out conversationally. I went to a screening of Passenger 57 years ago. I love action films. And I was talking about Wesley Snipes and how, you know, all the kind of references in the movie, the kind of die-hardishness of it, and just talking about action movies in general. And this person kind of looked at me, their eyes were a bit wide, and they said, "How do you know all this stuff?" and I said to them, "Well, doesn't everybody?" You know, I figured, what are you doing here? If you're supposed to be a film critic, if you're supposed to be reviewing this, what's the good of you if you're coming in like completely blind? So, but I guess not everybody is wired that way. Some people are wired to actually be able to make a living or a useful contribution to society, or to have, to not have crippling emotional issues, to actually want to buy useful things instead of just fill their house up with, mad plastic stuff that makes you frankly look insane the older you get. But, I'm not one of those. I'm not one of those people. So my head is just bursting with information. I mean, you can call it trivia for want of a better word. I don't think it's trivia. I think it's amazing.
The trouble with the word trivia is it's derived from trivial, right?
Yes, exactly. It's dismissive.
Yes.
It's like it's not very important. But it's like, it is important. It is much more important, unless you're on a desert island and you need to somehow derive moisture from the atmosphere, in which case that would be That would be more useful. I've watched the original Flight of the Phoenix several times, and I know you have to get something like a sheet, and you have to put it in some sand and a thing at the bottom. But obviously, this is like this. I'm so out of touch with reality that my idea of what reality is. I mean, that's literally how out of touch I am. That is what I think adults do.
Right.
My wife has an adult job. I imagine now that I think about it, that she could probably take moisture out of the atmosphere. So I wanted to make use of all this information.
Sure.
And I thought a quiz book, because the nerds that I know, and increasingly, through Twitter, I have many more people and have tremendous access to people like yourself, who kind of share my interests and enthusiasms. And, what we like, we retain all this information. We want to prove it, right? It's like there's no point in just sitting up there. It's the greatest use of information is to basically clobber other people with how much you know.
Yeah, of course.
So it's like, a quiz book is like the perfect way to entertain yourself and your friends, to prove that you know more than them, or perhaps to, with, the next day. It is a key to unlock your kind of nerd cred. And I wanted to write a quiz book for a long, long time. I used to, when I wrote for magazines, I used to write and edit the film section of this magazine called What's On in London years ago. And I always used to put up little quizzes for Simpsons or Bond, and actually some of those original questions all kind of filtered into my book, because recycling is everything. I believe in recycling, and never mind plastic. Recycle material.
Right.
You can use it over and over and over again, as long as it's yours.
Yeah.
You're stealing. So I wanted to write a quiz book for a long time, but people were like, Marshall, print is dead. I wrote this book of action movie reviews in the 90s, and after that, it was like, I really want to write a quiz book. It's like, Marshall, there's just really no, market for that. Everything's online. It's all internet. There's no paper anymore. It's all so. Had to wait until, people realized that was low. Not Kindles are fine, but I want a bookshelf full of books,
yeah.
Not a bookshelf with one Kindle kind of resting on the side. I want to be able to pick up a book and open it up and stick my nose in it and just breathe in those kind of old book fumes. Yeah. And if I could market a perfume, it would be 1970s comics. That would be my signature scent. I suppose actually it is my signature scent.
Whether you like it or not.
I haven't figured out how to bottle it exactly.
Yeah.
So as I turned less from print to digital, because print is, in terms of magazines and newspapers and stuff, those sort of outlets, they have no budgets. They're all dying dinosaurs. So I turned to more kind of digital. And when I wasn't really happy with what I was doing, if I was doing something kind of non-geeky material, I used to run the websites for like Blockbuster and HMV, and it's not my fault that they all went out of business. Let me just say that although I kind of worked for all these ailing companies, that I'm pretty sure that the social media and blogging I did for them was not responsible for their downfall. Well, maybe.
Well, I used to work for Blockbuster as well, so we're both culpable.
So I used to. So whenever I kind of got dissatisfied, I kind of spent more and more time on Twitter, and I found it more and more satisfying that you get instant response. That I could write about what I wanted. I could trivial stuff. I could talk about vintage stuff. I could post stuff, videos and things. And so somehow, after a while, I ended up with like 100,000 followers. And I mean, it wasn't just like by mistake. You actually have to put quite a lot of effort in to get that far. Yes. But I enjoyed doing it, and then when I hit that magic number, I found a publisher who thought that I actually had enough juice to actually then go back and write a book. So I had to kind of leave print behind, completely embrace digital, and then I was able to write this book and just put everything. Well, not everything, but there's definitely room for more books. Yeah. I want there to be a revenge of Vintage Geek. A Vintage Geek Strikes Back, or we can and keep going, but Vintage Geek is definitely it was incredibly satisfying to do, and it's just, I think it's more than just a quiz book, because a lot of my answers, you might find this hard to believe, are quite long. I'll ask the question and then there'll be the answer, but then there'll be like a whole page of additional information, because there's just so much interesting stuff, and it's like, so if you could pretty much read it as a total geek textbook if you want. And I also, every chapter has kind of like these autobiographical introductions in which I talk about believing that Tom Baker was actually Doctor Who. When I met him when I was 6, I actually thought that he was Doctor Who, having no concept of reality back then, and talking about how when I watched The Shining when I was a kid, how the little glick boy tapping at the window meant that I didn't sleep for a long time. I wanted to kind of write about why those things were important back when they were first important, so that people could kind of maybe tap into that sort of feeling themselves. The feeling that you would get when you kind of go home with your first or second copy of edition of 2000 AD. And you think, oh, should I take the stickers? Should I take the Barnick stickers off? Or they weren't Barnick, were they? Or should I keep them on? And it's like we were kids, so we didn't actually think, oh, this is going to be collectible in 40 years' time. We immediately took the stickers off, put them on our arm, and ran around in slow motion, pretending that we were bionic. And I just wanted to kind of tap into that. So it's the world's first semi-autobiographical quiz book, I suppose. I'm so happy with it. It's like I feel this tremendous sense of relief that a lot of the madness that was purely contained in my head is now out. It's like let a lot of the pressure off, I think.
Sure. So like I can sort of empathise a little bit, in like I know that in my line of work I have a lot of things I have to juggle, and so the only way to really manage the fact that the only way to manage sleeping is to write down a list, right? Because then it's out of my head and it's on the page. So it must be similar to that. Like you're constantly thinking about these trivia, this trivia. I hate that word, but these.
Well, but yes, it's always on your mind, isn't it? And when I was writing this book, I was like a magnified nth degree sort of pain in the arse. My kids, my wife, I just really don't know how they dealt with me, because the only way that I could deal with it was for the first time in years to actually have proper, pure focus and only do the book and try not to have my attention split between 100 things a day. And I would spend, Monday to Friday watching movies, TV shows, researching, digging through stuff through my books, through, the internet. Also, making sure that I had more than one source for as many things as I possibly could. And it was just an incredibly satisfying, exhaustive period where I would wake up in the morning, I'd be thinking about questions, what I had to see. I'd have a pad by the bed. It was like I would go to sleep thinking about questions. I would go to sleep 2-3 in the morning. I would wake up like 4 hours later. I would just completely work myself closer to the grave. But it was just totally worth it. It was so satisfying to kind of throw myself into it and to have an excuse. It's like I have to stay up all night watching John Carpenter films because I have my self-imposed deadline. So,
Sure, yeah.
And thrillingly, because I think a lot of people collect because they want to feel a little bit of ownership over the things that they love.
Yeah.
If not ownership, then they want to feel like a part of it.
Yeah, connection, right?
Yeah, definitely. Physical connection. It's like, for example, I love Jaws. Everybody loves Jaws.
Yeah.
I just got this pop of Jaws.
Nice.
It's Quint. And holding this in my hands makes me feel a little bit closer to that movie. Like have a little bit of ownership.
Yeah. There's are you a Star Trek fan?
Oh yeah.
So First Contact, right? When they go back and Picard and Data are at the Phoenix. Is it the Phoenix? No, it's not. It's it is the Phoenix, the ship.
The Phoenix sounds right.
Yeah, and Picard touches it, and Data says, "Does tactile contact change your perception of it?" And it's like, that's yeah, right. Absolutely. He's linked to it. So like, bring it back around, like that connection. Like you say, that you're holding that Jaws pop vinyl. It makes you feel like part of Jaws, right?
Oh, it absolutely does. Whenever I go to a museum or an exhibition with something and everything is behind a kind of like velvet rope, I always sneak a touch of it. My wife says, stop touching everything. It's like, but then, I have to have a connection with it. Yeah. Like I went to this exhibition in Miami years and years ago, and they had the Ghostbusters building, the miniature of the Ghostbusters building,
gosh.
And they also had the mothership from Close Encounters, and it's like velvet ropes can fuck right off. There is no way I was not going to touch that, and I remember touching them, and I feel like I tremendous satisfaction from having done it.
Yeah. You've mentioned your wife and children a couple of times. Like, so are they massive nerds like yourself? Do they buy into what you do?
No. If I'm a maximalist, my wife is a minimalist. I think if I was married to somebody like myself, I think that would be like, that would just be too much. It would just be more than the world could handle. Certainly more than our house could handle. So no, I think that is my anchor in reality.
Yeah.
Is my wife, Ruth. Without her, I would just completely spiral, I think. So I need somebody to kind of snap me out of it from time to time. It's not easy to snap me out of it, but I think I do need it occasionally. So like when we moved into our house, where we've lived here for like 10 years, a little over 10 years, she said to me, you can have the largest room in the house, but you have to keep all of your shit in it. You just try not to infect the rest of the house. Yeah. And it's like, fine, absolutely, I do that. But every day she comes in and she sees that some new things have appeared on the ceiling, because, I have to maximize space.
Yeah.
She's like, she finds it more and more oppressive in here. Because I think of it as like a huge toy womb.
Right.
It's more like a womb. Like every time I come in here, I feel tremendously comforted by it. Yeah. It has to be organised. Yes. I don't want it to be messy.
How about your kids? Are they? Do you find them taking interest in things like that?
Well, my youngest Phoebe has more strong nerdy tendencies, but she's not necessarily nerdy about all the same things as me. She's very much into kind of the MCU, and she likes some anime and other things. So I like that they have their own things to be nerdy about. Yeah. My daughter Maya, she will deny that she's any kind of nerd, but she really likes old movies and.
Oh. That's nerdy in its own right.
Yeah, and she loves going to the cinemas. So it's like, both of my kids, they have different qualities, but I can see myself in both of them. And I did a quiz event a few nights ago, a sci-fi quiz at my local cinema, the Bromley Picture House, and Maya was the only person who knew that the robot in Metropolis, his name is Maria. So so I know I've done something right.
Yeah.
When Maya was 10, and I showed her Metropolis, which is quite a long film and silent. So I did most of the voices. I think I maybe add a little bit to the entertainment value, but the fact that she retains that, I was so proud. I love the Picture House cinemas. I'm having my book launch on October the 10th at the Picture House Central. As soon as I started getting a relationship with them, and they, I started doing quizzes, I thought, hang on, maybe they'll let me do that in London, have the launch. So if anybody wants to come down, October the 10th, I'm hoping that it will be massively oversubscribed, and there'll be a huge crowd. There'll be riots of people fighting for copies of my book. So everybody is welcome. Come on, bring your friends.
How did you go about actually writing it? Like bum on seat. Like what was the method to getting that done? How did you decide to structure it in the way you did, or what was the thought process around that?
Well, first of all, I wanted to make sure that they weren't kind of these wimpy-ass questions that you would get in in some magazine where they basically just want the maximum number of entries. So they ask a pathetically simple question, like, how many legs do you have? What is your name? What's that blue thing in the sky called? It's like literally where it's got to be so easy they just want you to enter. I wanted to make a quiz that was actually, you had to earn it. Yeah. And so obviously there are some more straightforward questions, but I also think that, like at the quiz the other night, I said to them, right, I'll start off with a few easy questions. And I saw some faces on some people that like, these are not easy questions. But like I said, it's easy if you know the answer, obviously. So it was very important to hit the right kind of level. I didn't want it to be completely impossible. I wanted some of the questions to be completely impossible. I don't think anybody should feel they know everything, and I would challenge anybody to get all 50 right in of any of my 20 chapters. Right. I would love that, but I don't think I could get all 50 right, even having written the questions. Yeah. There are a few, it's like, shit, I can't remember, especially on some of the Tom Baker ones or the 2000 AD ones. I mean, I wanted to make quizzes that were quite hardcore, but that covered a lot of bases. There are certainly things like, if you're familiar with them, that won't be as challenging as others. Like everybody if you like action films, you'll be able to answer most of the action movie chapter questions about action movies of the 80s. If you like, Spielberg films and talking, the early stuff, Jurassic Park and Jaws and Raiders of the Lost Ark, films that everybody's familiar with, you're going to be able to answer a lot of questions from that chapter. There's a lot of very familiar stuff that I think that people will enjoy. But there are some seriously hardcore chapters where if you're not a proper fan, you're better off just reading the second half of the book where the questions are reprinted with the answers and just reading it as kind of a trivia list or quizzing other people and saying, what, you don't know that? In terms of actually doing it, I'm a huge list maker.
Right.
I would begin the week with deciding the chapter. I had a list of 20 chapters that I was going to do, and I would look at it and I would think, that would probably start Sunday night. And which chapter? What am I going to be completely obsessed with for the next week?
Yeah.
And I would pick it. Say I would pick the James Bond chapter, and it was just Roger Moore. I don't want to be obvious. Don't want to do Sean Connery. So just the James Bond cinema of Roger Moore.
Wow.
So I would first things first. I would sort out all my screeners. Obviously I've got all the Bond movies on Blu-ray. I would sit through them. I had a pad. I had a few pads, and as I was watching it, I would write down notes, anything that I thought would make a good question. If I could convince my wife or my kids to watch with me, so that they could come up, and kind of twist their arm, and they could help me come up with some questions, then I did. But mostly, I kind of watched the stuff alone, pen and paper. Just kind of scribbling down notes and ideas. So the first day or so was more like just kind of thinking about it, making notes. Then I would go and do some research. A lot of Bond books, a lot of Bond sites, trivia sites online, lots of, kind of IMDb stuff. But, a lot of that information is inaccurate. Mm. So, but, I found that, if I would kind of read through things and I would kind of discover some interesting things that I didn't know, but then I would kind of research them and try and kind of hone them down into an answerable question.
Yeah.
I say answerable, hopefully answerable.
Yeah.
So it was kind of like I was just kind of whittling down. I was kind of sort of sculpt the quiz. I'd get all this information after seeing all the films. I'd become completely immersed in it.
Yeah. And
so that my already kind of decent knowledge of those films would become like super kind of hyper exaggerated, like I just put my head in the plastic educator in Forbidden Planet, and I just kind of massively upped my IQ about the subject for a week. And then I would do it. I would whittle it down, and hopefully by the end of the week, I would have 50 questions and answers that I was happy with, and wording it just right, and making sure that and if there was an answer but there was more information, that it would automatically trigger that I would include all that extra information. I found lots of things, lots of kind of funny little stories and asides and quotes that I wanted to include, not as the answer, but you would learn some more stuff from it. And I'd end every chapter with writing about writing my introduction. And finishing the introduction, usually last thing on Friday before dinner time. That would be my, I would try and finish by Friday. I kind of set that on myself. Yeah. But it did take 5 days of intense, absolute effort to come up with, kind of a chapter which is 50 questions.
Yeah.
Answers. At the same time, I also, because I have a lot of celebrity followers now, somehow, because, you think these people are kind of rich and famous and successful, but so many nerds, so many, who connect with us on that level, toy collectors and comic book readers.
Yeah.
And so I've kind of connected with a lot of people, and it's been the most thrilling experience that I reached out to many of them. And I have 50 celebrity questions in my book. Some people I managed to reach out to my cousin Ronald, who I mentioned earlier, is now, he's a producer. He's amazing. He's still amazing. He's still my hero. He produced the Twilight Zone play in London earlier this year. But he put me in touch with like George Takei.
Oh, wow.
So I got a Star Trek question from George Takei. Mark Hamill, I'm not connected with, but he's very active on Twitter. So I just reached out and asked him for a question. He came back with a Star Wars question. So I got that. But also lots of people, like I got a question from my John Carpenter chapter from John Carpenter. Also, wow. Sam Neill, Sandy King, John Carpenter's wife and producer on his later films. She gave me a question. I've got Tom Savini gave me a question for Dawn of the Dead. Obviously, he's great special effects, Gorefest. John Russo, who co-wrote Night of the Living Dead with George Romero, he gave me a question. I've got a question on The Shining from the kid Danny, from Dan Lloyd.
Wow.
I got a question actually about Cinderella in my Disney chapter from Carrie Henn, who plays Newt in Aliens. I've got a question on Flash Gordon from Sam J. Jones.
Wow.
And I don't say this in a kind of boastful way, and I don't say this in a kind of like, oh, you've got to buy the book because of this, although I wouldn't hate it if you did. I say this because these people were so important to me all my whole life, and for them to actually take the time to contribute to it. When I see that, they're in something that I've created, it's like, it just totally blows me away, and they've been so kind and so generous. Yeah. And I feel like I've actually created this nice, geeky thing that belongs in my collection. Yeah. I've made something that is at home amongst all my stuff, and I hope that other people, when they get it, that they'll feel that way.
I was going to say that before, that you've got this drive, it seems, to make sure that those answers are facts, so they're right. They're right. You like you say, you've honed it down to get it right, which Absolutely. Also leads into, it's like a pedigree. You've got a pedigree of questions there. You've got all those people, so categorically it's from the source.
Yeah, you can't argue. If John Carpenter asks a question, I've got a question from him on the thing. It's like, you can't argue with bloody John Carpenter.
No,
you can't. And Sam Neill gave me an In the Mouth of Madness question. I know maybe I should have asked him to it would have been obvious to ask him for a Jurassic Park question for my Spielberg chapter, but no, I love In the Mouth of Madness, and for me, I think he's so wonderful in that film, as he is in everything, really. Yeah. But when he gives you a bit of trivia that I doubt anybody, no one's going to be able to answer it, because I think until he told to me that nobody, that he was the only person that knew it.
Brilliant.
But you can't argue with it because it's Sam Neill.
Yeah, right. Well, this has been absolutely wonderful, Marshall. But I'm going to end the interview with the question that I ask everyone here. It's really important to me in life that people do take time to recognise what brings them joy. Joy is important. So my question always ends with, what brings you great joy in life? And I think you might have touched on it already a little bit, but what would you say is what brings you great joy?
Child smile. No, obviously not. Sorry, I don't know, rain on a summer's day.
Yeah. All the gift card statements.
Yeah. Motivational phrases on pillows. Hang in there posters. No, none of that shit. I don't mind kind of traditional happy making things, but they don't kind of really do it for me. All the things I've talked about are the things that give me kind of great joy. I think my mum passed away a few years ago. We were very, very close, and watching old films makes me feel extremely kind of connected to her, and not only connected to her, but connected to kind of childhood and all the kind of warm fuzzy feelings that you would get from that, of kind of security and not having to worry about mortgages and things, and there's just something incredibly pure for me about the love that I have for films and TV and comic books and toys and everything that kind of celebrates this great kind of geeky universe that we love so much. So and you see around you kind of my collection, my babies. It's like it all brings me joy. I feel like I'm kind of surrounded by joy all the time. Of course, my wife and my kids also, let me just say this, they're listening to this, although God knows they hear me speak so much, so they're probably the last people that are ever going to listen to this podcast. It's like just what they need. It's like, Marshall, can you shut up long enough so that we can listen to you talking 1 million words a minute in a podcast? It's like, I really think they're not, so I don't have to mention them, but just in case it gets back to them, let me also say my wife and kids. But you pick up a comic, you pick up an old comic, and it takes you back. But new stuff too. I watch these fantastic new streaming shows on Netflix. So, I find that it's not all about the past. It's like I'm not just stuck in the past. I'm always excited about new things that are coming out. I'm a big fan of, the MCU, and there's all. I think the Star Wars films are have challenging feelings about those. I quite like The Force Awakens, but so
that's another debate for another time.
Brings me joy so much. I'm absolutely kind of thrilled to say, and doing this, talking about myself. Boy, I just love this. Really, do we have to stop? Don't people want to listen to another 3 hours of reminiscences? Because
Marshall, thank you so much for your time. It has been a genuine pleasure.
Well, you're welcome. It was fun. I'm like a character going through some sort of time travel bullshit in my head. I do not think linearly. I go backwards and forwards. You asked me a story about 10 minutes ago, and I say, well, I was born 50 years ago, and it's like shit. And then I'm talking for 10 minutes, and it's like I don't even remember what the question was.
Yeah.
I'm like a nightmare interview. I would never interview myself. I would say thank you. I interviewed some people like myself, and I actually looked at the tapes and thought, no, fuck that. I interviewed Chad Jones once, and it was like he was mad, and it was amazing. He drew a picture of Roadrunner and Wally Coyote for me. I got that, but it was completely unusable, the interview, because he was mad and going everywhere, and I thought, oh, what a nightmare, and I'm exactly the same.
No, it's brilliant.